Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Happy you're here. We are joined today by a special guest, Jacob Goldstein. I think we should just get this started properly and have you introduce yourself to everybody.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I host a couple podcasts. One's called Business History. It's a show about the history of business. The other one's called What's Your Problem? I interview basically tech founder types on that show. Used to host Planet Money. And I wrote a book called Money, the True Story of a Made-Up Thing.
All very good. I will give another shout out to all of those.
What's your favorite?
Currently listening to Business History Pod, but the book about money for anybody who just wants a good understanding of how we got here today with the whole topic of money, that's my go-to. So
thank you.
Thank you for being here. Jacob, so you talk about business history, a podcast about the history of business. And so we wanted to talk about what we can learn from history about the current events of today. AI, data centers, people are worried about there being a bubble, among other things. And you pitched this idea, what we can learn from history. How about the Luddites? And maybe to tee that up for you, one common thing that you and Robert Smith talk about on your Business History Pod is whenever a new innovation happens, oftentimes there's some sort of backlash against it, disruption of the status quo. But then eventually there's the scale up of the technology. Eventually it becomes commoditized, normalized part of the economy, and then maybe consolidation. But let's start with that first thing, innovation and then backlash. Who were the Luddites? What can we learn about them in light of what's going on today with AI?
The Luddites were maybe the first backlash to what would be a stretch to call it the first innovation, but it was. It was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Happened in England in the late 1700s, basically. And the steam engine was part of it. But there was also new ways of making cloth. There weren't a lot of businesses then. Cloth was a big business in England. And people were coming up with machines to make cloth, which was a huge deal. It was one of the first times you really see automation-related job loss, which is this fundamental fear people have today with AI. And so the Luddites were skilled workers. So they had essentially worked for themselves. It was a cottage industry. And there were different skills in the process of making cloth. Croppers are my favorites because they use these gigantic shears, like big giant iron scissors to crop the nap, the fuzz off of cloth. And it was a pretty good job. There wasn't really a middle class in England in early 1800s, but they made a decent living. There were stories of the guys who would go into the pub with a 5-pound note in their hat. It's just, look, I'm rich. I can put a 5-pound note in my hat. They worked for themselves. They had this thing called St. Monday where they'd get drunk all weekend and then they'd be hungover on Monday. So they'd be like, yeah, it's St. Monday's Day. I'm taking the day off. And then the machines come along and put them out of work, essentially, right? Often automation is de-skilling. It takes something that someone had done with human skill and replaces it with a machine. And the workers who went to work at the factories that replaced the croppers were often children or women who had not worked as much before. They got paid much less. They had much less autonomy. So in fact, the Luddites were screwed by this technology. In the long run, the Industrial Revolution was great for England and the world, and I'm glad it happened. But the Luddites were rational in their opposition. They also had no political power. They couldn't vote. There were no unions. And so what they started doing was smashing machines. They'd go in the middle of the night with sledgehammers and literally break these machines. And they created this fictional general named Ned Ludd, who was the leader of their movement, who was a Robin Hood figure, basically. In fact, he supposedly lived in Nottinghamshire, just like Robin Hood. And these letters started appearing to the owners of the machinery saying, get rid of your machines or the army of Ned Ludd is going to come break them. There were these massive riots, and the mill owners, understandably from their point of view, started guarding their mills. There's this one famous incident where a guy has armed guards and the Luddites are marching in the moonlight. They break down the gate and then they're trying to attack the doors, but the guy has bolted the doors and the guards are shooting out the windows and actually kill a couple of Luddites. And Parliament passes a bill to make machine breaking punishable by death. They round up a bunch of Luddites and they hang them. They make the scaffold twice as high as usual and there's a public hanging. And that's basically the end of the Luddites. One interesting kind of macro thing that happened, if you zoom out, in the long term, when productivity goes up from automation, workers end up making more money, often overlooked. In the long run, using automation to get rid of jobs or allow workers to do more, but really get rid of jobs, it actually leads to workers making more money. But sometimes the long run takes a long time. In the case of England, in the early 1800s, it took 40 years before the wages of ordinary workers started going up. So the Luddites were sort of right, is one interesting conclusion.
Yet there's often disruption whenever there's these new innovations. And to bring this home to today, in context of what's happening, that's very much the fear all over again, except this time the stakes are bigger. And it's maybe the first time you could argue in some ways that this is like a full-on disruption of office work.
Yes. Now it's coming for us. And it is interesting to think about that. One difference is that office workers have political power in a way that Luddites didn't. One interesting thing to think about in the present context is, what will the political response be? What will the social response be? And that might get closer to the kind of active questions you're asking when you're thinking about an investment thesis. Will a political response meaningfully affect the growth prospects of any given company? It seems like a hard but interesting question.
It has happened very quickly, immediately, except the political response was supply chain management and trying to restrict exports of hardware to China.
The international question is the salient one now. And to some extent, the international nature of it, I think, reduces the chance of putting on the brakes. When a few years ago, all those credible people were like, let's pause for 6 months, one response to them that seems like a reasonable response was, well, China's not going to pause for 6 months.
Yeah.
And so certainly to this point, clearly that fear, the international competition, seems to be the dominant kind of political consideration. And maybe because we haven't really seen job loss yet. In fact, unemployment is still quite low.
Yeah, the headlines aside, some software companies especially have, you could argue, a lot of corporate bloat that they never took care of. And maybe before we go too far down this, Jacob, there was a question about this in particular with the Luddites and past resistance, because you can almost start to see, especially in the US, some small little seeds of discontent being sown, not just worry about job loss, but also this potential that the build out of AI data centers is going to cause increases in energy, in power, and that's going to hit the consumer as well. There have been some isolated instances where communities have said, take your data center somewhere else. It's not welcome here. It's not exactly smashing up the machinery and trying to slow the whole thing down, but
yeah, the mechanics of the pricing of power in the United States is trying to understand how ASML's machines works or something. It's super complicated, and people are talking about complicated ideas to allow the hyperscalers, basically, the 4 companies or whatever it is that are building the giant data centers, to keep building their data centers without raising the price of power. And that is actually an extraordinary story. 2 days ago, I was moderating a panel at South by Southwest on nuclear fusion, which is this still pretty pie-in-the-sky technology. And yet, billions of dollars are going into these fusion companies that are years away, at best, maybe a decade away from making power. And it's basically because of projected data center demand. Microsoft is paying billions of dollars to restart 3 Mile Island, the nuclear plant that sort of shut down the growth of nuclear power in this country. That's an amazing story.
it really is pretty long, far-sighted, far-reaching decisions being made around that.
It's so wild how capital intensive what they're doing is. It is incredible. You forget how much $1 billion used to be. $1 billion doesn't sound like a lot anymore, but it's a lot.
But now no one cares. We're talking about trillion.
I think Apple became the first $1 trillion company. That wasn't that long ago. It was maybe 7 years ago or something.
Yeah, now we're talking about not just companies reaching the next milestone in market cap, but we're going to have a company, maybe NVIDIA gets there first, who knows, that reaches the $1 trillion revenue milestone.
It's been interesting to watch the PEs on the giant companies. Their PEs haven't gone up that much You've probably watched that more closely than I have, but I was looking the other day and I was like, oh, they've tripled in value because they've tripled in earnings.
Yeah, and that's going to get wonky as well. That's one of the main pillars of Michael Burry's arguments as of late with this.
Meaning they can only get so big. There's only so many people who can buy, or that they're all buying from each other now. That one seems more interesting.
Yeah, that's another pillar of his argument. I guess there's a lot of pillars to the argument that he's making now. One of them, though, being the wave of depreciation expense that's coming because of all the capital expenditures on this stuff coming. We'll see how that plays out. Almost impossible to play games with free cash flow, but it's a tricky metric because, as the hyperscalers just proved, for anybody that had any doubt whatsoever about it, in 2025 and 2026, free cash flow is really lumpy. There's nothing predictable about it. One last thing before we continue on, we have a couple of questions. This is maybe another risk for investors to think about. Whenever there's innovation that comes like this, one risk that's maybe underrated is if there's a corresponding rise in pushback against the technology.
Nationalization is a strong word. I think Alex Karp used that word recently. But government involvement is a more moderate term. And it seems reasonable to have the government be involved in the AI business at some margin. It already is. Plainly, the Department of Defense has been intensely involved lately. And so thinking about what government involvement might mean is complicated. I don't know that it points in some particular direction. The government has been putting money into building fabs domestically on a different end of the stack. Do you think about that? Like more on the kind of frontier AI company end of things? What's the government role going to mean for them?
Yeah, at some point, essentially cloud, which is really the underlying theme for all this AI stuff happening right now, is being pitched and compared to another utility service. What utility isn't governed in some way by the government? So yes, it's another risk as well. And maybe some grassroots pushback on this, it makes that happen at some point in the future. And even before AI, there's plenty of people that were gunning for big tech. We have the round of antitrust against Google and Amazon.
A lot of those cases persisted from the Biden administration. They were started with Lena Khan, who was quite aggressive in bringing antitrust cases against big tech companies. And J.D. Vance explicitly agreed with those. And the cases continued at least for a while under the Trump administration. And so it is an interesting point of at least some agreement between the administrations, which clearly don't have a lot of points of agreement.
It's kind of gone quiet, but probably reemerge.
Yeah, it seems likely. Guess. It's so big and so high stakes, and there's a small number of key players. These things all point toward the government being involved. Although historically, big companies have been pretty good at capturing regulators. The railroads were one of the first to be regulated. And there's this sort of regulatory capture story, which is, the existing railroads used regulation to create barriers to entry, basically, to build themselves a regulatory moat. And I think you've seen that. I remember this was maybe back when Meta was Facebook. They were calling for some set of regulations that would basically make it harder for new competitors to emerge because it was super expensive to be compliant. And if you're a big, rich company, then it's great. Make some expensive compliance rules. That's great. We love that. So it could go that way.
Yeah, and it is a problem as well. I can recall especially Bill Gurley talking about this a few years ago about Silicon Valley hates regulation because it makes it harder for startups to gain traction against the big established companies.
If by Silicon Valley you mean startups, they hate it. But if by Silicon Valley you mean Meta and Google, maybe they don't hate it, right?
Yes. The smaller end of the spectrum in Silicon Valley. Yeah.
Mere billions. Companies worth mere billions hate it.
Yeah. They love it. The VCs and their cohorts in investments, not so much. Can we draw similarities between how AI is affecting the job market and how the emergence of computers or the internet affected it?
Computers and the internet were pretty good for the job market, I think. For a long time, the mystery of computers was, why aren't we seeing them? There's this famous quote from Robert Solow, the economist who was a big growth guy in the 20th century. He said, we see computers everywhere except the productivity statistics. But that was in 1980 something. So that was computers, but pre-internet or certainly pre-web. And the 90s were this incredible boom. The dot-com bubble essentially coincided with a great time in the American economy. Wages were growing up across the board. Government balanced the budget. We had a surplus. And so maybe AI will be that. Could happen. At least for a while, we could be centaurs. We could be working with the machine. Certainly as an individual, that's what I'm hoping for. There was this long window with chess where it was a long time ago now that a computer program, Deep Blue, beat the best chess player. But for decades after that, a human plus a computer could beat a computer, which was my favorite metaphor, although that recently ceased to be true. Now the human just makes the computer worse. But I'm hoping, certainly personally, that I'll get a little window where me plus AI is better at making podcasts and writing than AI alone. So that's what I'm going for personally on a job level. And you could see that, I think, in a lot of industries. It is the case. People think about AI as tasks, but in fact, jobs are more complicated than discrete tasks. It's actually hard, and there's lots of edge cases. And maybe it'll be like autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, where it's 15 years ago, it was like, oh, it works. Oh, except there's a million edge cases that we have to solve. I remember being in an Uber 10 years ago and being like, oh, this guy driving the Uber is not going to have a job. And now I'm the guy driving the Uber. And I'm like, there is still a guy driving an Uber, so maybe I got a while.
Yeah, I think that kind of reductionist reasoning on the potential disruption of AI, I think is just too simplistic. It's almost like the same argument as because of AI, software engineers aren't needed anymore, and therefore also software companies aren't needed anymore. There's a lot more to a business than just the product.
The other thing is there are big shifts. The automation of agriculture is incredible. 150 years ago, most people were farmers in America, and now 2% of people are farmers. We did have a sort of accompanying broader industrialization that allowed people basically to go from the farm to the factory. But that's the dream. The dream is that it happens slowly enough and with enough new jobs appearing that everybody's okay. The China shock is another interesting analog. The U.S. basically allowed China into the WTO around the year 2000, picking up after our internet story now. And there were places in the U.S. that made stuff that competed directly with China at that time, like clothes, that were in fact screwed. There are these series of papers by this economist, David Autor, and a couple others called the China shock. And they show that basically metro areas where those places were in fact screwed. America was better off as a whole because we got cheaper stuff and Americans got richer. Stuff getting cheaper does make ordinary people richer overall. But there are losers, just like with the Luddites. We might see that.
Absolutely. And it's not always geographically driven either.
Yeah, this one seems less geographic, right? It seems more sort of task specific.
Yeah.
Like the dream is like some element of redistribution. The happy technology story is it increases productivity. Productivity is the way everybody can get richer. But there are some losers. And so you take some amount of the bigger pie to help the losers so that everybody's better off. That's like a toy model. And I know it sounds naive to say it that way. But in the long run, that has been what has happened. And ideally, you minimize the suffering in the short run.
Yeah. A delicate balance that needs to be struck, for sure. One more question, and then I want to ask about something you guys talk about on Business History Pod, Jacob.
Yes.
Not investing related, but it's interesting and ironic that the issue with innovation is that it moves the goalpost closer and closer. When the goalpost is so close, the reward of accomplishing something feels less.
Yeah, or sometimes it disappears altogether. Remember the Turing test? For 50 years, 70 years, everybody's like, if this happens, it'll be AI. And clearly, so the Turing test is basically if you're chatting with a machine and you can't tell if it's a machine or a person, that's AI. Maybe now what we would call AGI. The Turing test is done. Nobody talks about it anymore because it works. It is interesting how normal it all, like, chatbots are amazing. Large language models are so good now. And there's an interesting distinction that I have observed, which is people who tried them, whatever, a year ago or something, were like, oh, they hallucinated, they weren't that good. Just don't have any idea how much better they are now. Or people who just will like go in and try and one-shot something and it won't be exactly right. And they sort of want it to suck. I hang out with a lot of journalists, basically, and it's kind of journalist-adjacent people. And they want it to be bad because they feel threatened by it. They want to say, oh, it's bad. It's not as good as me, essentially, which is an understandable response. But I think in a lot of dimensions, they're wrong. It is quite good. And if you try and make it be good, it's extremely good. Claude is the one I pay for. And I've been sort of seeing what I can do. Can I train it on my scripts? Can I upload books. When I'm working on a show, I'll usually read a book, a couple books, and then I'm in the middle of it. I'm like, oh, here's this complicated thing about, I was just doing Lloyd's of London. It's a good one. Their business got quite complicated in the 20th century, just the structure of it and the model and who's paying whom to do what. And I could just ask Claude, like, wait a minute, the members agents over here and the underwriters here, what's going on there? And it was quite good at answering and giving me citations. This is high level.
It has gotten exceptionally good. And I think that's our viewpoint here on it, especially when used in the hands of someone that has a very specific goal with the AI, especially workers, then it becomes really powerful because there is still the whole AI slop problem out there. But I think that goes back to the point that technology, yes, there's often some disruption, but it does make everybody better in the long run, especially if those people are knowledgeable and skilled in what they do. And then now they have a new tool to help speed up their productivity.
It's a tool for now.
Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you about this because some of the narrative, maybe shifting focus to a different aspect of the risk of all of this. When you and Robert talk about the history of these different business figures or businesses or technologies, there's this theme that eventually, sometimes it's very quick, sometimes it's over the course of decades or maybe even hundreds of years, like the tin can. Super fascinating.
More interesting than it sounds, the story of the can. Check it out.
It's super interesting.
My favorite thing about the tin can is they invented it, and it was 50 years before they invented the can opener. They were using hammers and chisels for 50 years. So my question is, what's the thing now where we have the can but not the can opener? What tool is just going to make this thing we already use so much easier to use? I don't know.
Yeah. So that's a long, ultra long period where nobody thought about how amazing the tin can was anymore. It became commoditized. For me anyways, it was not that long ago where cloud software was the big innovation. And now we're not even half a decade removed from that era, let's say, to use investor convention of segmenting everything into eras.
Yeah.
Basically the sunset on that era during the pandemic. And now it's left for dead because AI is going to replace it all.
This is the SaaS apocalypse story you're telling. Yeah.
But how do we not have exactly the same thing? Eventually, we're going to have AI native startups that turn into publicly traded companies. They're going to have IPOs. But how does the same thing not just simply happen to them within the next 10 years as well? That's just the norm. Everything that's new now, eventually, we're not going to think about it anymore. It's just going to become a normal everyday thing. And the pricing power, the value of being an investor in that is going to diminish. Does that happen to AI?
From a user point of view, you hope so. Pricing power going away and a thing becoming commodified is bad if you own the company, but it's good if you're buying stuff from the company. The way things get cheaper is somebody does something new and then their patent runs out or other people figure out their trade secret or whatever, and it becomes commodified. It's interesting to think about the companies that have avoided that. The surprise in some ways of the last 10 years, perhaps, is that Google, Microsoft, and Amazon kept growing so much, so fast. I remember when Apple got to $1 trillion, as we were talking about before, people were like, surely that's got to be it. But that was not it. And those companies did not become commodified, amazingly, weirdly. I was reading somebody making the point that Amazon clearly has its own lane, and Google clearly has its own lane, and Microsoft has its own lane. But it seems like the frontier AI models are much more similar to each other. Like Gemini and Claude and whatever, GPT, seem more similar to each other than Microsoft and Amazon and Google, which are clearly doing different things. So that does seem to increase the risk of commodification. I suppose a counterargument might be if one of them gets first to recursive self-improvement, then it just goes to the moon and figures out how to destroy its rivals or something.
Us.
Yeah, or us. The people who are building it worry about it destroying us. So we shouldn't rule that out. But what do you think about that?
It has to be inevitable. And it made me start thinking about this more because especially in the last couple of years, I think if I could pick a sub-industry of software where it started first, I'd have to pick cybersecurity, where the biggest cybersecurity companies, including the hyperscalers themselves, just basically went out and started consolidating market share to themselves. Some of the private equity firms got in on this as well, starting especially a few years ago.
They were just doing roll-ups. It was just acquisition frenzy.
Some of it's just like bolt-on. Okay, we need this new capability, like Palo Alto Networks buying CyberArk. We'll take that, we'll bolt it down to our platform. Google just finished the acquisition of Wiz,
Uh-huh.
massive cloud native application cybersecurity company, now part of Google Cloud,
Okay.
which is where so many startups are building applications now. More cloud rent is going to get extracted.
Is there rent to extract or is it commodified? Those are sort of the opposite, right?
This is where I've started thinking about this. Maybe it started with a place like cybersecurity. There's hundreds of software companies out there just in the publicly traded market, let alone private software companies, and then an endless number of startups that are constantly popping up. But in listening to your episode about Ford,
Yes, there were like 400 car companies when Ford started, in part.
which is crazy. That's totally nuts.
But it's totally nuts because nobody had figured out that you could have an economy of scale for cars yet. Cars were craft
Yes.
production. It was like 10 dudes in a garage building one car at a time on a wooden stand. That's actually what a car company was at that time. Maybe it was 100 and they had 10 stands, but there was not an economy of scale and the workers were skilled. In a way, it's like the Luddite story. You had to be good at fitting one piece into another because they didn't really have interchangeable parts. And so it was a high-skilled job. I wonder, as I say that, now I think of writing code. There is this interesting question that you alluded to earlier of what's going to happen to code. And that does seem to be at the front line of AI right now, of AI automation. And it doesn't mean that engineers are going to go out of business or going to not have jobs, but it means their jobs are going to be super different. It seems like they're basically not actually writing code anymore, which is a huge deal. Right. Maybe the biggest deal we've seen so far. Something happened with Claude Code in December that was like in a behind the curtain way, maybe as big as the ChatGPT moment. It wasn't observable to people who don't write code, but people who do write code freaked out. And I trust them. I believe them. How do you adjust your investment thesis based on that development?
If we could use that analogy, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago, and I didn't at the time think I would ever refer back to it ever again, but basically saying it's time to think about software not as technology, but just as another product. And so maybe we're moving into this phase where it's less about the ingenuity of writing the code and the technology, the nuts and bolts of it all, to how do we scale up the supply chain, the manufacturing, creating better, more efficient. Maybe
a factory. We need a software factory. We need a Henry Ford for software. It has been a craft industry. And now we need a software assembly line full of Claude Code agents overseen by clever foremen. That's fun.
And I remember it was just a few years ago. It was not long before the small little company called DigitalOcean that used to focus on small and mid-sized businesses, cloud platform, cloud infrastructure. Now it's more designed for just anybody who codes or tinkers and wants to build software. Their former CEO had cited the prediction that the world was going to need 50 million software engineers by the end of this decade. And I don't think anyone is talking about that anymore because it has fundamentally changed. And I think maybe we're reaching this point where companies that are going to lead need to vertically integrate their supply chain and manufacturing. They also need to broaden the scope of what they offer customers, become more of a platform, and try to figure out how to better reach efficient economies of scale, because that is ultimately the problem with so many of these software companies. It seems to me, you can see the potential for them being highly profitable companies, but most of them just never really live up to that hope or that promise.
Yeah, well, I mean, the dream of software, the fact of software that there's zero marginal cost. A million licenses cost you basically the same as 100 licenses, right? Trivially more. That's a rad business if you can get there, but it's hard to get there.
And the companies that you do see with these really insane looking operating profit margins are actually the infrastructure companies. Visa comes to mind.
Visa has a duopoly. Speaking of extracting rents, Visa is definitely extracting some rents from us.
Yes.
One interest, people talk about the one-person unicorn as one kind of marker of AI, is when will there be a startup that has one person that's worth $1 billion? When I think about AI changing the way companies work and the way work works, it does seem likely that it will be startups that do interesting things because, well, for the classic reason, this is one of the historical lessons. It's just very hard for incumbents to make the change. And in some ways, it's not even rational. The original, people use the word innovation all the time, but the Clayton Christensen innovator's dilemma, you know, the guy who brought that term to its Silicon Valley use, his thing, his argument, and he had these historical stories about it. Actually, one of which was hard drives. I think of the iron one, but one of them was hard drives or memory or something. Basically,
Yes.
incumbents have these high margin businesses that are good businesses. They're incumbents. And the innovator comes along and doesn't beat them at that business. They do some crappy thing that's cheap and that the incumbent doesn't care about because it's a worse business. It's a lower margin business. And they're like, why should I invest to lower my margins? But the innovator starts with the crappy lower margin business and then eats from below. There's a story about rebar, steel companies in America getting beat by rebar. And there's some memory story. But anyways, what we call AI slop, and is AI slop, I'm not a fan of AI generated content at this point, could be that. It could be the crappy, cheap thing that is the beginning.
That's true. We definitely know all about that just with our experience here in dealing with, I guess, our self-proclaimed competitors.
You have AI slop, chip stock investing.ai.
The worst location for it to date, I think, is LinkedIn, which is just a nightmare app anyways. But whenever you open LinkedIn, top of my feed is always a very clearly AI generated post about semiconductors. It's engaging someone or they wouldn't write it.
Yeah. But if you think about the cost to them being so low, the slop problem is you can generate content for basically free. And so they just generate a lot of it. That feels a little bit like email spam in the 90s or something. There was a moment where it was like, oh my God, spam is going to break email. And they used probably machine learning. It was probably AI before we called it AI. It's like a perfect machine learning problem to figure out what's probably spam and what's probably not. So hopefully that'll solve slop. The other thing, you can use AI to write good stuff. It just takes longer than using AI to write bad stuff.
The one-liner prompt and calling it good.
Very often, I'll see things on LinkedIn, for example, and it'll just be so obviously AI. And I don't exactly know why, but there's a certain kind of rhythm. There's a certain kind of generic AI rhythm, like blah, 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 and then the sentence paragraph. And it was kind of like the cheesy grind set engagement bait on X, on Twitter, had that same rhythm and tone. That seems to be winning for now. I hope that goes away.
And this maybe perpetuating the problem is all those platforms are now using that long form content generated by AI to train more AI. Dear God.
Yes, but if it's all bad, that's good for us. To the extent AI generated content is actually bad and that we can make things that people prefer, that's good for us. When it gets good, that's actually, in a narrow professional way, bad for us.
Garbage in, garbage out is still very much a thing.
Yeah.
Thinking about the eras of technology and investing when the AI economy moves from data and infrastructure towards products and services, could we have a risk of another dot-com type bubble where public companies make trash that looks good to investors? Trash meaning actual end products, not just even software, but also humanoid robots. You would never buy a humanoid robot for your home unless you were going to start an IG channel and make it funny.
Not a bad idea. One of the interesting distinctions between then and now that might be cloaking that is how much longer companies stay public. When you look at the valuations at which companies went public in the 90s, it was definitely less than $1 billion. Was it even less than 100 million? I don't know. I haven't looked back at it for a while. But it may well be the case that's going on now in the private markets. And we just don't see it as much because they're private. You couldn't be $1 billion private company without profits in the 90s. Nobody would keep giving you money. The market didn't work that way. And that's an interesting difference.
Yeah, maybe there's too much money in venture capital now, perhaps.
Seems unlikely that there's too little.
Yeah, and a lot of it was sitting on the sidelines after 2022, and now it's being deployed again, and there's a lot of it.
Did you hear the show Shell Game? This guy, half as a joke, he's a journalist, decided to start a company run solely by AI agents. When I interviewed him about his show, and I was saying, so you play it for laughs. He makes a company with his agents that's supposed to help you procrastinate on the internet or something. It's silly. He's playing it for laughs. But he's like, look, there are actual companies in Silicon Valley that are getting funded at the pre-idea stage. So he's like, I'll put myself up against them because at least I have an idea.
Okay, so I want to get back to one of the original questions that was submitted. This is a perfect segue for it. This question for you, listening to your Atari episode.
Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good one. There's a lot of interconnectedness, such as You guessed it. It's Steve Jobs, Bob Valentine from Fairchild that we
Yeah.
talked about last week.
Yeah.
Different episode, but Sears, which we talked about a few weeks ago, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Does this interconnectedness stem mostly from your research, and or do you think it's just inherent in the US market, technology industry, innovation? Are there aspects to investing where we may be able to benefit from such connections, whether it's in our own research or how the market, innovation, and companies are positioned and structured? And it's a good segue because you just said there's companies in Silicon Valley where they're not investing in the idea, they're investing in the person.
Yeah, that's what venture capitalists always say. And so if you're going to do that, maybe the guy doesn't even need to have an idea. To go more directly to the question, let me answer the first part, and then you can answer the second part about the investing thesis.
Okay.
I think the interconnectedness is real. Silicon Valley is extraordinary that way. And we did a couple shows, one on the birth of Silicon Valley and then one on Atari, which came right after. And it has always been that way. It was originally a small number of people all in the same place. It started, frankly, when a bunch of guys quit. The guy who invented the semiconductor, Shockley, co-invented it, started a company, and he was a monster. He was a terrible boss. And a bunch of people just quit and were like, we're going to start a company, which was not a thing that young engineers did. And venture capital was not a thing. And so they found a random guy who ran a photography company in New York to stake them, Fairchild, and they started Fairchild Semiconductor. And then Fairchild Semiconductor, those guys then left to start Intel, and all these other companies came out of it. And I think that has really persisted. It's incredible that it has stayed in the same place. You would think now that it could be anywhere, but it's not. It's all still there. OpenAI is there. Anthropic is there. Right now, it's still there. And it's the same people. The people who started Anthropic left OpenAI to start Anthropic. It is still true, and it's extraordinary. So yes, that's that part. It's not just our research. It is really this incredible agglomeration that is local and personal. What does it mean for an investing thesis? That's your part.
It's not even just technology, even the Sears thing. And I think the connection there, if I remember correctly, was with the A&P episode.
Well, no, Sears was the first retailer for the 2600, for the Atari.
Yeah.
They needed a retailer so that they could get funding to scale up. And it happened to be Sears, which we had done a story about. And Sears at that time was the biggest retailer in America.
There's the connection.
Yeah, that's the connection there.
For an investment perspective, there's a reason why you get brilliant people that flock to these themes, and a web is created and it's all interconnected. Either like the PayPal mafia that came out of the dot-com era, and now you have people coming out of that.
PayPal mafia is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Thiel, Reid Hoffman, Elon, the guys who started YouTube, David Sachs, who's now the AI czar, the all-in guy. All those guys were at PayPal, partly because that company was wild ambitious. It was kind of proto-crypto. They were like, oh, we can do money on the internet. They were bigger than, oh, it's the way people will buy stuff on eBay. They were dreaming very big.
Yeah. And now you have those guys that went on and created stuff, and then new talent coming out of that. Mira Murati used to be at Tesla, and she just landed big fundraising for.
And then she was at OpenAI,
machines.
right? She went from Tesla to OpenAI to her new thing.
And there's a reason why that is. And I know this is why we gravitate towards these secular themes with our investing research, is because if there's something exciting happening and or there's money to be made, it just attracts maybe some not so pleasant people that you wouldn't want to put money in, but it also attracts really brilliant people that are going to come up with new breakthroughs, new stuff. It ends up being very interconnected, and your odds of landing on a good investment end up being higher, especially now in the 21st century. Statistically, you just have better odds of picking a winning investment if you're fishing in that pond versus doing the kind of the old school classical value investing thing where you're just going off of the financial fundamentals and hoping that you've found something that's cheap.
Yeah.
The statistical nature of it has shifted.
Yeah, it's better to be a bad company in a good sector than a good company in a bad sector at some level. There's that idea. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm going to ask a question. I would love to know what people want us to cover on business history. We don't typically write about what's happening now, but we do origin stories of companies that still exist, certainly.
Yeah.
If you're listening on YouTube and you want to put it in, I will come look at the comments. So I love getting ideas. I want to make shows that people want to hear. So let me know what you're interested in.
There is one that just came through. If you guys have done an episode on Bell Labs, I don't think you have yet.
We haven't. We should do Bell Labs. Yeah. We did Edison, which is kind of the proto-Bell Labs. The amazing thing about Edison was his industrialization of innovation, creating a machine, a factory for ideas, which was really what Bell Labs did. We talked about Shockley, the guy who co-invented, let's say, the transistor. He was at Bell Labs. So we've kind of nibbled the edges, but we should do a Bell Labs show.
Also, another one on the Warren Buffett episodes, now the single version of Charlie Munger.
No, we cut Munger. Robert, my co-host, was the lead on that. He did most of the work on that. Do you know Munger's weird UC Santa Barbara dorm dream? He wanted to give all this money to UC Santa Barbara to build a dorm, and he had designed it himself. And none of the rooms were going to have windows. It was going to be like some weird capsule hotel, so you could fit more rooms in it. And in the end, Santa Barbara was like, oh, no thanks, we're not going to take that money, but thank you.
I did not know that story.
There's a little Charlie Munger lore for you, yes.
Just as interesting, if not more interesting character than Warren Buffett.
Yeah. I was thinking of him when you were talking about your anti-fundamentals pitch. Oh, not a Warren Buffett guy.
Not so much. First public piece I ever wrote was actually why you should ignore Warren Buffett.
That's a good way to get in, punching way up.
Back when LinkedIn was still typed out by human beings.
Back when it was cool.
Or just still sucky and was about to get a whole lot worse when Microsoft acquired it. I'll throw my name in the hat here, actually, for this.
Please.
This goes even further back, but Dutch East India Company is super interesting.
Very deep cut. Yeah, 1600. I actually wrote about that in the book. Basically, first multinational corporation, first stock market. I think there were joint stock companies before, but they created the stock market for that one stock. There was like a random little loophole in their articles of incorporation that said you could sell your shares to somebody else because it was going to be like 10 years before they gave you your money back. Companies were not immortal then. The corporation more generally, those two guys who were at The Economist, Micklethwaite and Wooldridge, I think was the other one, they wrote a book called The Company. I don't know if you ever read it. It's a short book, but it's good. The development of the limited liability corporation is itself a cool story. Companies are weird. It's not like a thing that occurs in nature, and it's interesting that they have come to dominate. One of the crazy things in the Lloyd's story is they had unlimited liability until the 90s, basically. People were underwriting these insurance policies with unlimited liability. Wild.
Huh.
Yeah.
All right. Lloyd's coming soon to your favorite podcast outlet. Ton of historical coverage for the giant Reliance Industries, India-based.
We should do that one. Good idea.
Dhirubhai Ambani.
Yeah, the Ambani, there's a family, right? There's like a rise and fall, I think. It's on the list. I don't know it as well as I should, but that is a good idea. We haven't done much of anything outside of the US and Europe. India is super interesting. I'd love to find a good China story. I was looking at Mitsui, this one of the giant, it's like Mitsubishi, you don't hear as much about it here, but it's 400 years old or something. Yes. And so that one's on the list.
The family-run conglomerates.
Similarly, Korea, Samsung was a noodle shop 70 years ago or something.
Right.
Yeah. And now it's Samsung.
Yeah. Casey just wanted to say here, since she's off screen, she wants to hear a story. This is a selfish request, Casey. Shame on you. About the history of healthcare insurance.
Okay. Good one.
Rotten U.S. healthcare insurance.
That sounds like a very straight take.
No, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
And then also Nintendo. Jen's Nintendo is old. That's a good story. Bell Labs, but also Bell Telephone.
Yeah, we had a little Alexander Graham Bell moment in the Edison show because Edison was his rival, basically. They were trying to make a better telegraph. That's what both of them were doing, which is an interesting innovation story. The phonograph came out of trying to record incoming messages so the guys at the telegraph office didn't have to write it so fast. It wasn't like, oh, we need music in the home. That's a good parable. You don't even know what you're inventing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Look forward to that. And then railroads.
Railroads is so big. Stephen Ambrose has a book about the transcontinental railroad, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. There's so many characters and so much happening. We have to do railroads. We want to do Jay Gould. He's part of the railroad story. But yes, sign up now. I promise we'll do railroads this year. We just got to figure out how to do it.
And then before we started, you also mentioned Jack Simplot, the potato guy turned Micron.
Yes, I was trying to think, what is a chip stock investor related show? He was like a Idaho potato guy, and then he made a handshake deal with Ray Kroc because McDonald's, they used to fresh cut their fries in the store, but they couldn't get russet potatoes in the summer, so the fries weren't as good. And so he made a deal to supply fries to McDonald's, good deal to make. And then he was early into Micron, which amazingly is in Boise, the counterexample to our everything's in Silicon Valley story.
That's a bizarre one, but also super good. Good stuff. You have all sorts of material here, Jacob, you and Robert.
Are more suggestions coming in? I'll take a look. Thank you to everybody for suggesting them. That is actually weirdly one of the hardest parts of the show, coming up with good story ideas. They're infinite, but then like with the railroads, that one is actually hard to make. How do we do this in an hour or 2 hours? It's a clear story with a manageable number of characters. I get them confused. Whichever one, is it the Union Pacific? I will know when I do the show. The one that started in San Francisco. Even with that one, there was Leland Stanford and Mark Hopkins and Huntington, these giant California names. And then there was the engineer. It was hard to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and it took a lot of people to make it a clear story. Is an interesting challenge. By the way, if people are watching this on YouTube, you can find Business History on YouTube. You can just comment there if you have suggestions. You can email us at businesshistory@pushkin.com. I'm delighted that people are making suggestions.
Yeah, do it. Everybody go check out Jacob and Robert Smith. It's on YouTube. It's on podcasts.
Your podcasts.
Jacob, thank you for coming and joining us today. I enjoy what you do and appreciate having the conversation with us today about AI and what we can learn from history. Super good stuff. Everybody check out Jacob at Business History Pod and What's Your Problem?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun. I love the hand. I was saying to you before we started, I love this. You should only live and be well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob.